into the early hours. Behind it, clear spells and scattered showers as we head towards Monday morning. Some of the showers could be heavy at times. Overnight temperatures generally single figures behind that weather front across the north and the west, holding up around 12 degrees in London. But it means a grey start Monday morning in the southeast with some outbreaks of rain. This pushes away. Bright skies following, some sunny spells, but the risk of showers following on from the north. Some of these could be heavy at times. The odd rumble of thunder is possible, and temperatures fresher for all. Showers on Tuesday too, but then it should be drier for Wednesday, temperatures rising a little.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes & Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Hello and welcome. This is Calvin's Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson, on your TV, online and on your wireless. Today, we will be hearing from a teacher talking about taking action against her local authority after she was dismissed for refusing to use a pupil's preferred pronouns. I'll be discussing whether the Archbishop of Canterbury has overstepped the mark by getting too involved in politics. And in the Duel, my duelists will be discussing the Green Party councillors in the Highlands who've called for religious representatives to be barred from voting on the local authority's education committee. With me as my sidekick this week is Emma. Emma, what's your 30-second take on that?
I think that this is, too much secularism. I think that it's just simply wrong to assume that secularism is neutral and that these people should have a voice on the Education Committee. They're obviously there for a reason in the first place, and I think it's overbearing for them to be barred from being able to contribute.
And my nemesis, Aaron Bastani, your 30-second take?
I haven't got extraordinarily strong feelings about it, but I think that the arguments put forward by these councillors, which is that you can hold democratically elected people to account if they make mistakes, is a good one.
Fantastic. More on that in the Duel coming up. But before that, here's the news with Tatiana Sanchez.
Calvin, thank you very much and good evening. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. A call has been made for a special summit to bring an end to the toxic rail dispute. RMT union boss Mick Lynch has written to the government calling for a meeting with an independent chair if necessary to end what he's described as chaos on the railways. It comes as passengers face another day of disruption, with workers again joining picket lines. More strikes are set to be held on the 31st of May and June the 3rd. That's the day of the FA Cup final at Wembley. Now, protesters have been demonstrating against the proposed ULEZ expansion plan. Motorists were beeping their horns in support of the protesters in Orpington. The mayor's proposal to expand the ultra-low emission zone could potentially reach the Kent border by August. Some outer London boroughs, along with Surrey County Council, launched legal action in February over the proposed extension, and protesters have said it'll hurt them financially. The Labour leader says he's ready for a dirty and nasty campaign ahead of next year's general election. Sir Keir Starmer used a speech at the Progressive Britain conference to outline his vision for the party, which involves changing the entire culture. He also admitted more work needs to be done to reconnect with working people. Now, momentum is building ahead of tonight's final of the Eurovision Song Contest in Liverpool. The UK's entry, Mae Muller, who will perform I Wrote a Song, says she's ready to get the show on the road. She's one of 26 acts to appear before an estimated global audience of 160 million viewers. The UK agreed to host the contest on behalf of last year's winner, Ukraine. Eurovision host Graham Norton says the calibre of performers has excelled over the years.
I personally think we're going through a kind of golden age of Eurovision. I really think the shows for the last few years have been great, really good songs. And I think that time of, there was always a kind of a nostalgic thing and a kitschy thing and a campy thing. And there's a little bit of that left, but actually now it's just a bunch of great pop songs.
Now, a 99-year-old woman's lifelong dream to have knives thrown at her has come true. Don't worry, it was all part of an act, and the former circus worker couldn't wait to step back in the ring to have blades hurled at her by a professional. Annie Dutblock, who turns 100 years old in August, asked to be part of the performance as a birthday treat. She said she really enjoyed the experience and was ready for the next one. And special behind-the-scenes footage has been released from the King's coronation. The Prince and Princess of Wales have published a 5-minute video on their official YouTube channel, including footage of them in their coronation robes before being taken to Westminster Abbey. Royal fans also have the chance to see Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte preparing to leave home at Kensington Palace on the morning of the service. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Calvin.
Instead of a monologue this week, I'd like to use this opportunity to call for prayer for peace. The situation in the Ukraine has become even more divisive than Brexit, lockdowns and vaccine mandates. Many people who were awake to the media manipulation during the former seem to be completely falling for the approved narrative on this one, hook, line and sinker. It is a dire situation, and I won't go into the politics of it because that's not the point. I'd just like to take a moment to kind of highlight the double standards at play. Andrew Bridgen MP quotes a Jewish scientist who says the situation with vaccine injuries is the worst since the Holocaust, and everyone screams anti-Semitism. Yet the moment anyone raises the slightest of concerns over Zelensky's handling of the situation in the Ukraine, they're instantly called Hitler apologists. Putin is bad. He is a bad man. He is not Hitler. How is that comparison appropriate? The war in the Ukraine is not World War II, and the comparisons are frankly lazy. One should be able to call out the financial corruption, the neo-Nazis, the shutting down of opposition parties and media, and the persecution of Orthodox Christians in the Ukraine without being painted as a Putin sympathizer. One can see the wrong in Russia invading the Ukraine, whilst also seeing that the Ukraine is far from perfect itself. Nuance, people. President Donald Trump seems to be the only world leader who gets this. In his recent interview with CNN, I was taken back by how humane his response was. When the biased interviewer clearly wanted to paint him into a corner, in backing a winner, Trump called for peace instead. When he was badgered to pick a side, he said, and I quote, "I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people. I want everybody to stop dying. They are dying, Russians and Ukrainians. I want them to stop dying." Surely that is the approach we should be taking. If you are the praying type, please pray for peace in the Ukraine and for the lives of Ukrainians and Russians. May their leaders put an end to the bloodshed. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, two Green Party Highland councillors have called for religious representatives to be barred from voting on the local authority's education committee, as they are currently permitted to do. Under the Local Government Act of 1973, Highland Council is obliged to appoint 3 religious representatives on the Education Committee, in part because of the large number of denominational schools in the country. It is time for this week's Duel. And to debate this topic, I'm joined by my brilliant duelists, my sidekick Emma Webb, and this week's nemesis, founder of Novara Media, Aaron Bustani. I'll start with Aaron this week. Aaron, is this religious discrimination?
I don't think so. This is in response to basically a piece of legislation from the Local Government Act 1973, for your viewers out there and the listeners on DAB. It's in response to that, which is a piece of legislation which basically says that, as you said at the top of this, there should be religious representatives because of the high concentration of effectively religiosity in the area historically. Now, I don't know if that's still the case. So I'm sure probably it's more religious than the UK writ large, the Highlands. And these Green councillors are saying, well, as elected representatives, we don't think it's appropriate in the 21st century to have unelected representatives who are responsible for education policy because if things go wrong, people can't get rid of them. They can't boot them out and they can't scrutinise them. And I think there's a reasonable argument there. You know, I would say if you do want religious representation, it makes sense to have perhaps a seat which is open to religious representatives who are then chosen by local communities. Turnout will probably be very low, I'm sure, but I suppose given the argument put forward by these councillors, at least that would create the sort of basis for scrutiny and accountability.
So still have a religious seat, but democratised?
I think so.
Emma, are you with Aaron on this one?
I quite like that idea. I mean, I also don't feel very strongly about this, particularly because it's something that is, so remote from us personally in the Highlands. I don't know exactly what the sort of local community is like there, and it probably has seen a decline because the entire country has seen a decline of the Christian population. But I don't think, as with other sort of comparable situations, I don't think that just because this country sees a decline in religiosity, that necessarily means that we should start imposing a sort of French, not that I'm suggesting this goes that far, but a sort of French-style secularism. Because I think the assumption is that secularism is a sort of neutral position, but it's not. And so I think that just because you see, whether it's temporary or not, decline in the Christian population in a particular community or in the country at large, that doesn't mean that we should be de-Christianising our local communities and their representation.
I would argue it's actually the opposite, because secularisation is increasing, that we need more religiosity. And actually, if you look at what's happening in Scotland with the indoctrination of young children in schools and how far the queer theory progressives are pushing that curriculum, surely we need more religious representatives to be the moral compass on these education policies.
I actually think that, in a way, I imagine it forms a sort of checks and balances system where you do have those who are elected being held accountable by those who can put forward a sort of religious, ethical, moral position that is perhaps outside of what those elected representatives would be offering, and to possibly, pull them back a little, rein them in, if they are going down a road of teaching things that will be controversial to the communities that in that area are traditionally Christian.
Absolutely, and these religious reps, they haven't been using their voting powers, Aaron, so maybe that's why people want to get rid of them, because they haven't been taking advantage of the opportunity they've had. But if they're gone, who's going to be the moral compass on these education committees? It's
such an interesting question. I mean, obviously, this is one of the core questions that you ask repeatedly on this show every week, which is, what does a life of obligation, duty, meaning, values look like in an increasingly secular world, an increasingly secular country? And I think it really is important to say, it's just an objective fact, that we aren't necessarily a secular country, that certain communities are more religious than others. So, for instance, if you look at Jewish communities in this country, liberal Jews, I think, have a birth rate of like 1.5. Then you have Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews have a birth rate of 7. They're living very different social existences, similar with Christian evangelicals, very similar with Muslims. So this idea that we are becoming more secular as a country, I mean, on the face of it's true, but there's an interesting kind of contradiction here, which is, yes, overall we're becoming a less religious society, but those who do have faith actually are more drawn to fundamentalism. And this is something we've seen over the United States in recent decades. And I think that does ask big questions, because particularly for people in quote-unquote mainstream religion, because their role for 100, 150 years, 200 years, as obviously the role of the state crew, was, like you say, to provide that moral compass. And if they don't, and you have the rise of fundamentalism, I think that creates quite a big vacuum.
So can you answer Emma's question about neutrality? Is there such a thing as secular neutrality?
I doubt it. I mean, you've obviously got different models. You've got the French model. I think it has upsides. I think it has downsides. You have the Turkish model. Well, that seems to be, frankly, going in the dustbin of history, because Erdogan's taking it in a more religious direction over the last 20 years. So, I quite like the Nordics, but then again, they have a relatively similar role for the church as we do in public life. So, unsurprisingly, similar sort of social composition, geographically similar, obviously, in Northwest Europe. So it's an interesting one, but I suspect not.
And Emma, Aaron seems to suggest that the secular and the religious the divide is widening and religious people becoming more fundamental. Do you see that?
I don't think so. I think that because of the situation that religious communities now face, particularly the way in which they're increasingly marginalised, and this is probably one example of that, increasingly marginalised from sort of being able to speak in public in a way that I think so. I mean, you've seen many people like Tim Farron is a good example. He had to resign from his position as leader of the Lib Dems because he's a Christian, and the two weren't compatible. But I think that, Christians particularly, I think, feel under an awful lot of pressure, and for a long time Christians in this country have been almost quite cringing about even saying that they're Christian. And so I think that now things have gotten to a point where people feel that they need to more robustly assert what they believe, because those things are being so challenged by radical ideology that is being presented as neutral but is very, very far from neutral. But asserting those religious values and those and traditional worldviews and traditional ways of life is not the same thing as being a fundamentalist.
Because the Overton window has shifted so far that the traditional views look more fundamental now.
Precisely. Warren Jeffs of the Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints, that's a fundamentalist.
Well, thank you, Emma Webb and Aaron Bastani. My duelists, I love that this duel is so reasonable, and a lot of you have been commenting, actually saying they disagree well, and I love to see that. Please give us your comments as well. Email in to gbviews@gbnews.uk and also tweet us. Let us know what you think about today's topics, including the subject of my Twitter poll. This week I'm asking, with Justin Welby's constant moralisation of politics and politicisation of faith, is it time to boot the bishops out of the House of Lords? Head over to Twitter to vote, and you can also email your views on that. Plenty more to come on my Common Sense Crusade. Next, we'll be discussing the Archbishop of Canterbury's latest foray into politics. Should he be getting involved? Let us know.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel, sort of find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson, on your TV, online and on your wireless. The Archbishop of Canterbury has weighed in on government policy once again by using his seat in the House of Lords to castigate the government for their migration policy. Is it the place for a man of the cloth to be lecturing a democratically elected government which is simply trying to implement a manifesto pledge? Joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Gavin Ashenden. Father Gavin, thank you for coming on to discuss this. First of all, I know you've got a checkered history with the CAB, but what are your thoughts on the Archbishop of Canterbury getting involved in political matters like this?
Well, my remarks don't apply just to the CAB. They would apply to any bishop or archbishop. There is a principle that if you have pastoral responsibility for a community, that what you don't do is express your own political beliefs, because your community will be made up of people who represent the whole political spectrum. And if you start wading in and expressing your own politics, then immediately the people who don't share your politics won't feel safe with you, effectively. And you stop being a pastor, stop having responsibility for them. So the Archbishop has broken the first cardinal rule of pastoral care that any priest or bishop or archbishop must follow.
Well, absolutely. Does this highlight the thin line between moral guidance and political partisanship, do you think?
Yes, you can't do both. You simply can't mix those kind of politics with moral guidance. The reason for that is very simple. The political judgments invoke morals from both sides of the argument.
That's been the issue for me, actually, that it's been painted as there is only one moral side of this. I'm going to bring my dualists into this conversation. Emma, I watched some of the House of Lords debates, and some of the Lords, particularly the Greens, were saying, this is inhumane, this policy. It's like the emotive language they use, there's no true debate there. They're not going to put forward alternative solutions. They just want to say what the government's doing is morally unacceptable. I don't think that's true. I don't necessarily agree with the policy. I think there's lots that could be changed in it. However, I don't think it's immoral. What do you think about that?
I don't think it's immoral either, and I think they're alienating, as Gavin was alluding to, they're alienating a huge number of their flock, and essentially trying to suggest that people who don't agree with their position on a government's policy, a government that was elected by the people on a promise to lower migration, they are trying to sincerely, and I think that if they were being truly Christian about this, they would have a sort of generous, charitable interpretation of the government's sincere effort to try and deal with a very serious problem. I think that they are, in doing that, they're essentially painting anybody who disagrees with them as being sinful. And I think that it just shows how far the Church of England's leadership have strayed away from their purpose. Now, I don't think that this means, as your poll suggested, not that I want to sway the votes in any way, that means that we should disestablish the Church of England or kick the bishops out of the House of Lords. I don't think so. But I do think there is a fundamental problem at the heart of the Church of England, and if they're not careful, they're going to completely tear the whole thing down.
Right, I tend to agree with you. I did put that poll out there, but I don't think we should kick the bishops out of the House of Lords. I think the bishops are there for, like what we were talking about earlier, Aaron, to be a moral compass. However, and I do actually think it's Justin Welby's job to give a moral guidance on these issues. The problem I have is the partisanship and this divisiveness of his rhetoric in suggesting there is only one appropriate way, and it's his way.
I wonder with you two, is it because, I think it's quite clear to me that Welby's kind of like a new Labour figure, personally, his personal politics. If he was agreeing with you, presumably you would have less of a problem. That's a serious question, because I personally think he shouldn't be intervening politically. I think, look, if a policy which he advocates fails, nobody holds him accountable for it. With an elected politician, you go to the people, you get a mandate. If you do what you said you were going to do, you get voted in again. If you don't, you get the boot. That's not the case with people who are unelected, well, that's why I would frankly scrap the House of Lords, but let's park that for a moment. It certainly doesn't apply to archbishops. But I wonder, it's one of those things where, if the person agrees with what I'm saying, Liberals love Welby, because they're agreeing with everything he says. My thing is, even though I actually agree with the substance of some of the things he's saying, although I agree with you, the language probably isn't that helpful, and I personally disagree with the policy because I think we're looking at 1 million people net migration this year into the UK. Small boats is a tiny fraction of that. The Tories focus on that because of failures elsewhere, but we'll park that too.
I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah, we'll park that too. My criticisms are more, sort of political than moral, I suppose. But I on a personal level, I can't stand the chap. And that's even though I actually probably agree with most of his sort of, ethical prognostications and assessments. I can't stand the man because I feel like 101 Christianity, take the beam out of your own eye before casting aspersions about others. God is here to judge us for our sins, nobody else. And I feel like Justin Welby's going around judging people all the time. It seems very strange.
That's the problem. I don't hate the man. I actually feel sorry for him because he's in a difficult position. However, it's not because I disagree with him. It's because he doesn't leave any wiggle room. He doesn't, like Emma said, there's no charity there. So he doesn't say, OK, I understand that you're trying to stop the people smugglers, you're trying to prevent the death from people crossing the channel legally, or you're trying to look for more legal routes, or you're trying to solve the gang crime that's coming over from Albania, which is a safe country, or people leaving France, which is also a safe country. You're looking at different things. There's no charity in that at all. It's just, you are all inhumane, you're immoral, and my way is the only way. That's the problem I have with Welby. But could you see an Archbishop of Canterbury in there making these moral compass points, providing that guidance without being partisan?
I think there's a time when the leadership of the Church of England and the bishops did. I think there was a time when, perhaps not in recent history, where they had a clearer sense of what their purpose was. And actually, I think you can also apply this to the monarch. So I don't think that the monarch, whether the monarch agrees with me or disagrees with me, the monarchy has a particular purpose. It serves a role within our constitution. I don't want the monarch expressing partisan views. And the same also goes generally, I think, for the clergy, and this is not an attack on you, Calvin, of course, because you're very political, but I think that the clergy need to be very careful when they're shepherding their flock. Their purpose is to preach the gospel and to find the lost sheep and bring them into their fold. They need to be very careful in how they engage in politics. And that applies even more so to those who are at the very, very top of the Church of England. Now, that doesn't mean to say I don't think that there isn't a role for people who are churchmen who are also quite political. But those who are at the top of the Church of England, they have a role to play. They are also the custodians of an institution, and they need to do that job with care. So I wouldn't agree even if they were putting forward very partisan views in favour of the Conservative Party. I would see that as probably a bit sycophantic. So, you know, I think that the situation that we now have is the Church of England doesn't understand what it's doing anymore. It's basically become a woke corporate, which is also the reason why we agree on something, Aaron, because I fundamentally dislike Justin Welby. I don't think that he's fit to lead the Church of England.
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for that. And thank you for Dr. Gavin Ashenden. Sorry about his line, it cut out there. We'll get him back another time. Plenty more to come on this evening on my Common Sense Crusade. Next, we'll be hearing from a teacher who was dismissed for refusing to use a pupil's preferred pronouns.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
If we beat the establishment.
Welcome back to the Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson, on your TV, online and on your wireless. A Christian primary school teacher who was sacked after refusing to use a pupil's preferred pronouns is taking legal action against the council for unfair dismissal and religious discrimination. She says the school helped the 8-year-old girl transition into a boy 2 years earlier, demanding that staff use the child's preferred male pronouns and male name. The primary school pupil was also allowed to use the boys' toilets and dressing rooms. The teacher can't be identified for legal reasons, but I spoke to her a little earlier and she explained why she felt compelled to intervene.
The question I was always asking was, are we doing harm? Can we, look into this and have a proper discussion about this? And so it came to the point where I formally raised it as a safeguarding concern. So having spoken to the head teacher, I sent a letter to the head and the governors of the school. They basically dismissed my concerns. and said, from their point of view, the school had done everything that was procedurally correct. They'd gone through the right channels to get advice and all the rest of it. But the one thing they didn't engage with was hundreds of pages of evidence from experts who had worked in this field, medical experts, an endocrinologist, a psychotherapist, a psychologist. I presented them this evidence. All these medical experts were saying, don't affirm a child. It does far more damage than good. And that was the one thing they seemed unable to engage with.
The teacher is being supported by the Christian Legal Centre, and I can speak to its barrister, Rebecca Benstead, now. Rebecca, thank you for joining us. The school is claiming that this teacher has breached GDPR. Now, surely that's not relevant here if this is a whistleblowing case for a safeguarding concern.
Well, that's right. They are saying that, but nothing in data protection law prevents somebody from raising legitimate safeguarding concerns. So they're not correct about that.
And the school also claims that the teacher's views were discriminatory. Is it not the school that's being discriminatory against the teacher's Christian views for compelling them to go along with this?
Well, this is actually much more about concern for a vulnerable 7-year-old child and the way that a school are dealing with a child's gender distress. So this is a teacher who is brave and principled and is concerned that the school are not properly responding. Instead of taking proper medical advice and getting a team, a multidisciplinary team around the table and considering this child's situation and potentially the issues that are behind gender distress, which quite often are caused perhaps by neurodiversity or perhaps trauma in the child's life. Instead of considering those things, the school was very, very quick to move to an affirming policy and to allow a 7-year-old to present as a boy for all purposes at the school.
I think it's absolutely outrageous that a 6, 7, 8-year-old is going into the wrong toilets and the wrong changing rooms. That's a safeguarding concern for that child, but also for the other children around them. And if a teacher is being bullied out of her job for raising this concern, what hope do other teachers have?
Well, that's true. And in fact, this story started rather before this child was even on the scene, when the school introduced training for all the staff. This training came from the local authority and from somebody who had a Stonewall champion sign-off on their email. And it was training on transgender issues, which was entirely partisan and without balance and was inappropriate. And the teacher raised this even before the child concerned was in her class. And she said that there should be balance and that there are obligations that the school has to make sure that they're not politically partisan. And they're presenting gender ideology belief as fact, and they're doing it to the staff. And so that was the first thing. So it wasn't really a surprise when a child with gender distress presented themselves, that the school went then immediately down the line of accepting that the child should be socially transitioned. And of course, social transition has serious risks for a child. It puts them on a trajectory which may well lead to breast binding for a girl and potentially puberty blockers and all the health risks that are associated with that. And this was being done without proper risk assessment to the child or to the other children in the class, and was not being done based on proper independent medical advice. So the teacher raised a safeguarding concern, and when it was ignored, she took it to the governors. She then took it to the LADO, the local authority designated officer, with evidence, with weighty evidence from medics, as you've heard. And this really was not engaged with at all, and she wasn't taken any notice of. So the question was then, well, what to do? Where you think that somebody's being harmed and nobody's listening, what do you do? So she took legal advice, and she was helped by Christian Legal Centre to bring a judicial review to challenge the school's policy, which was what happened. But she ended up then being dismissed by the school, who accused her of a breach of confidentiality in sharing that information with lawyers.
Absolutely ridiculous. Well, thank God for the Christian Legal Centre, and thank you for telling us about this, Rebecca. You mentioned the outside resources. I managed to ask the teacher about this. Here's a clip of that right now.
There is no room for debate. There is no room for actually grasping that question and saying, are we doing harm? Can we be impartial about this? It's not impartial. So, yeah, I mean, the school probably thought that they were doing well by using these materials, and these materials are in every school. The school I was at, I wouldn't say it was a school where they were pushing the agenda as much as they were being informed by it.
Yeah. I want to bring my dualist into this conversation. Emma, we've got a school here that is pushing queer theory, gender ideology on children. A teacher is concerned about the safeguarding of one of the pupils in particular and gets dismissed because of raising awareness.
This is absolute madness. This is a teacher who clearly is sincerely trying to raise safeguarding concerns. Teachers have to be able to raise safeguarding concerns. It's common sense. We shouldn't even have to say it. And the fact that the teacher could be treated so appallingly in actually being dismissed as the result of actions taken as part of a judicial review. And the whole situation here just completely stinks. There's obviously something very, very wrong with the leadership within this school. I just think it's completely astounding. And actually, I feel sorry for the pupils at that school because they're clearly at risk if it's not possible for teachers to raise safeguarding concerns. And if I were a parent in this school and I were aware that this was going on, I would take my child out of the school.
Well, we'll come to Aaron shortly, but I did ask the teacher about the leadership, so I'd like to show that clip and see what her answer was there too.
You feel as though the leadership in the school are so bought into this ideology or to the principle that we shouldn't offend. We shouldn't cause offence to a child, that could be so damaging, that they can't hear what you're saying. It's as if they can't engage in any other narrative that would try to demonstrate what is really in the best interest of children. And of course, yeah, you know that you're going to put your job on the line if you raise this because of the culture that we're in at the moment. And it makes it, I actually do feel for head teachers who are put in this position because the guidelines from the government are so woolly that they've almost been put in the place of having to make a kind of a decision that really only a doctor should be making.
So that's the issue there, isn't it, Aaron? I don't think this was even a particularly woke head teacher. I don't think the head teacher had a political ideology that they wanted to push. It's just that this is the position schools find themselves in. The resources they're using from external agencies like Stonewall and Mermaids are already infiltrated with this queer theory, gender theory ideology. So what can schools do?
Well, there's a few points here. So firstly, the headline of the newspaper article, which is really informative, is wrong. This teacher was not sacked because of pronouns. They were sacked because of things actually you've touched upon in this show over the last 10 minutes. The GDPR seems to be like the smoking gun. And of course, that's appealing to a legal red line that's allegedly been crossed. So they were suspended initially for the pronouns issue, and then they wouldn't back down, as they've said, and they see that as a point of principle. Excuse me. What I don't quite understand here is they're talking about safeguarding and risk assessment. Where is the safeguarding issue? Because it's an 8-year-old child. It's not the pronouns, right? That's not a safeguarding issue or a risk assessment issue. It's not going into a toilet. You could have a unisex toilet between children at a kindergarten or a creche and nobody would say it's a safeguarding issue. So I don't quite know where they're saying it's a safeguarding issue. Then the person you had...
Well, I'll tell you, because it is the toilets, because the toilets are shared, gender toilets, and it is the changing rooms, because kids get changed together for PE. So if there's a girl going in boys' changing rooms, that's unsafe for the girl, but also not appropriate for the boys.
But you have unisex toilets for children. If you go to a kindergarten or some schools, you have unisex.
In general, they might be, but in this,
primary
schools, one of the concerns that she raised. So.
But I don't see how, legally speaking, and these are quite specific terms when you're talking to children about children or minors generally or vulnerable adults. Safeguarding is a very specific thing, and a potentially unisex toilet or pronouns doesn't fall under that. What they did say is, well, in the future they might do X, Y, Z. then I can understand why he says it's a safeguarding issue, or you might need the involvement of a doctor, or teachers are conferring upon themselves certain competencies, or schools are conferring upon themselves certain competencies that should reside fundamentally with medical professionals. But it doesn't sound to me, and maybe there's more to it, it doesn't sound to me like they're at that level yet.
There are also implications, though,
we're going to have to leave that one there, but if people want to see the entire conversation with the teacher, please check out our YouTube channel, GB News channel, and it's all up on there. Before we do take a final break, I'd like to look at what you guys have been saying about these topics. And on the topic of prayer for the Ukraine, Dave says, "Hi, Calvin. You seem to be one of the very few asking for an end to the killing in the Ukraine. Where are your fellow men of religious faith?" A very good point. Thank you for raising that, Dave. Jonathan says, "Only one person can bring peace in the Ukraine. That is Putin. If the Russians stop fighting, the war will end and there will be peace. If the Ukrainians stop fighting, Ukraine will end." Oh, Jonathan, I'm not even going to go into that one. Finally, this one on Twitter on the issue of pronouns in schools. "Pronouns are anti-free speech because nobody has a right to tell anyone else what words they can or can't use. Pronouns are compelled speech." It is compelled speech, it's compelled action. It's also compelled belief, which is why I'm so outraged that a Christian teacher has been essentially fired for not going along with it. Thank you to both of my panelists this week. We've had my psychic Emma Webb and my nemesis Aaron Bastani. Hopefully see them both again soon. And coming up in the final part of my Common Sense Crusade this week, we'll be hearing from the government's faith advisor on the role faith can play in modern Britain.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Earlier on this week, the Archbishop of Canterbury weighed into politics again, calling the illegal migration bill morally unacceptable. So I took to Twitter and asked, with Justin Welby's constant moralisation of politics and politicisation of faith, is it time to boot the bishops out of the House of Lords? The results are 89% of you said yes, and 11% of you said no. I love it when we're in the majority. Thank you for all taking part and sending your views today. Now, this month saw the publication of a long-awaited government report into the role of faith in modern Britain, called Does Government Do God? The independent review, almost 3 years in the making, concluded that faith is a force for good, but called for a clearer understanding to tackle issues such as forced marriage and faith-based extremism. It was written by Colin Bloom, an old friend of mine, a former director of the Conservative Christian Fellowship and the government's independent faith engagement advisor. I caught up with him earlier and began by asking him why the review was commissioned by Boris Johnson in 2019.
I think Boris's instinct was very much that there was a disconnect between government and places of worship, faith and people of faith. And so he asked me to do this review. That was 2019. I had a small team of people helping me, civil servants who were helping me do it. We started the evidence gathering process. And then COVID came along. And of course, that then delayed things a little bit, but it also provided us with a tremendous amount of additional resource for the evidence gathering. We did a call for evidence. We had 21,000 responses, one of the largest responses government has had to any call for evidence. And we did literally hundreds of face-to-face interviews and other interviews as part of the evidence gathering. The report was published just a few weeks ago, 65,000 words, 22 recommendations, 160 pages. It's a really heavyweight, in-depth analysis of how government engages with faith. So yeah, I mean, it's been reasonably well received so far, but it's a big document covering lots of subjects.
Well, I mean, there's lots in it that I agree with, but also lots in it that I disagree with. But I'm thankful that the commission was put in place in the first place, because I think a review like this is necessary right now. Obviously, over the last, well, I was going to say over the last 20 years, but over the last 10 years, the image of faith in this country has changed dramatically. What did the report show to kind of exemplify
Well, interestingly, faith is not going anywhere at all. I mean, it's growing. It's not going backwards. And early reports of its demise, I think, are way out of line. The majority of the British public have a faith of some kind or other. And whilst only, I think, 30-something% of people say that they do not have a faith, 60-something% of people say that they do. But that's changed. So 25 years ago, it would have been a predominantly Christian picture. Today, it's much more pluralistic. There's much more vibrancy and exciting. There's a rich tapestry of different faiths and religious expressions. And some of them are growing, some of them are going backwards, some of them are remaining static. But it's very much an exciting and fluid space. And one of the things, Calvin, that I think is the most encouraging that I was able to bring out in the report is just the overwhelmingly positive contribution that is made by faith and by people of faith, by faith-based charities, by places of worship. The contribution is really off the scale. And I make the point in my report that if places of worship and faith-based charities were to stop doing what they do, there would be a huge hole in society which government would struggle to fill. And so that's everything from mum and tot groups to food banks to after-school clubs, whatever it might be. And overwhelmingly, all places of worship, whether that's a synagogue, a mosque, a church, or a gurdwara, or a temple, they are places of virtue. So they are encouraging people to be better versions of themselves, whatever their faith-based preferences or leanings are. And again, that was quite an encouraging sort of set of evidence to uncover.
I'm with you in that faith is important and our country is built upon the Christian faith in particular. But you noted that there is a faith illiteracy in the UK at the moment. I noticed this myself. When the BBC puts anything out, it's often Bible school instead of seminary, or trainee priest instead of curate or deacon. There's a dumbing down there rather than a raising up. What were your recommendations to fix that?
Well, I think that's right. There is a huge faith illiteracy in public service, and you see that where police officers are perhaps rather clumsily arresting people that have no business being arrested because of their faith,
such as street preachers.
I mean that has happened, and I think some of that is at best it's clumsy, and at worst it's devil making, as somebody once told me. But but faith illiteracy it's everywhere, and it starts at school. It starts because RE is not taught. It's the Cinderella subject in schools. It's not taught particularly well, and so you've got a generation of British students who are not really understanding the people that they live with, the people that are around them, the people that live in their communities, particularly where faith has become so much more diverse than perhaps it was a generation or so ago. So as far as the humanities go, I think RE is a really important subject and does need to be, and RE teaching does need to be improved. But when it comes to public service, particularly civil servants who are engaged with the formation and then the implementation of government policy, if they don't know the makeup of the British people, if they don't know who they are legislating for, then we're going to have a problem. And I think we see that. So part of my call for greater faith literacy in public service will just make government more efficient and more effective.
I think you're right in a lot of the things you say there. However, I think the problem is the diversity of faiths, actually. When we look at what's happening in schools, assemblies, for example, used to teach the Lord's Prayer and hymns every day, and we still have a legal requirement for collective worship of a broadly Christian character. However, it's not implemented because people are afraid of being too in favour of one faith in a multi-faith society. So is there a way to get past that fear of not being inclusive enough that's actually making us not faithful at all?
Well, I think government need to be courageous, they need to be bolder. They either need to change the law about acts of worship being broadly Christian in nature in schools. They either need to change the law or they need to enforce it.
Yeah.
But where we are at the moment is an unsettled and very unhappy place. And throughout my report, nearly all of my recommendations, I'm calling on government ministers, secretaries of state, to be bold, to be courageous, and to sometimes tackle some of these knotty subjects that they've kicked into the long grass. It's what Charles Clarke, I think rather excellent former Home Secretary, said. He wrote a book called The Too Difficult Box, and where they find that there are these difficult, knotty problems, and they just put it in the too difficult box, rather than say, let's find a way of resolving it. So to your point about about collective acts of worship being predominantly Christian, government should be courageous. Either change the law or enforce it, but don't make good people like you unhappy.
Many thanks to the government's independent faith advisor, Colin Bloom. You can watch the full interview on our YouTube channel, GB News YouTube channel. Now, each week on the show, we like to end with our closing prayer and the collect for the 4th Sunday after Easter. O Almighty God, who alone canst order the unruly wills and affections of sinful men, grant unto thy people that they may love the thing which thou commandest, and desire that which thou dost promise, that so, among the sundry and manifold changes of the world, our hearts may surely there be fixed, where true joys are to be found. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. You have been watching Calvin's Common Sense Crusade with me, the Reverend Calvin Robinson. I will be back with you next Saturday at 7 p.m. Up next is the Saturday 5. Before that is a weather forecast. Have a good one. God bless. There's Fault.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. As we move into Sunday, we'll see rain across the north and the west of the UK. Sunny spells holding on for much of England and Wales. We can see that on the bigger picture, this weather front slowly pushes its way southwards through Sunday and then across England and Wales into Monday, introducing fresher air from the north behind it. So towards the end of Saturday, it's generally fine and dry for much of the UK. Low cloud continues to slip back southwestwards across England and Wales. And here's that weather front across Northern Ireland, northwest Scotland, giving some outbreaks of rain during the early hours. Under any clear spells, temperatures will dip into single figures. Where we keep the cloud and the rain, it will remain in double figures to start on Sunday morning. So a wet picture across Northern Ireland, Scotland during the morning. England and Wales after a cloudy start, it should brighten up. We'll see some hazy spells of sunshine developing. We could see 1 or 2 showers get triggered in the afternoon in the warmth of that sunshine, highs reaching into the low 20s. Fresher behind this weather front as it turns drier for Northern Ireland, northwest Scotland, though often quite cloudy here with some sunny spells. Through into the evening time, this weather front pushes a little bit further south and eastwards, eventually arriving across southeast England into the early hours. Behind it, clear spells and scattered showers.